I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Mackinder Forum. As you all know, I'm Len Hochberg, and I'm the U.S. coordinator for the forum. Our talk will be recorded. Before introducing our guests, I'd like to remind everyone on this call that we adhere to the Chatham House rule, which applies to the Q&A session to follow the talk. The Chatham House rule states participants in the Mackinder Forum events are free to use information from the discussion, but they are not allowed to reveal who made any particular comment or mention what organization they represent. Regarding the Q&A period to follow our talk, we request that participants limit themselves to one question at a time, and the temptation to lecture the other participants by way of introducing a question should not be indulged. Finally, if you do not have an opportunity to introduce yourself during the meet and greet session prior to the lecture, please do so briefly before asking your question. Your name and affiliation at that time will be sufficient. With that said, it is my pleasure to introduce Gordon Chang. Gordon Chang is the author of several books, most notably Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America, The Coming Collapse of China, and China Goes to War. Gordon is well known to the Mackinder Forum, having presented his work several times to our online seminars and in Washington, D.C., when we met in person prior to COVID. He has lived and worked in China and Hong Kong for almost 2 decades, most recently in Shanghai as counsel to the American law firm Paul Weiss, and earlier in Hong Kong as partner in the international law firm Baker McKenzie. His writings on China and North Korea have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the National Interest, and many other outlets. Gordon has appeared before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission. He has appeared on CNN, Fox, Fox Business, CNBC, and numerous other television stations. His speaking engagements have taken him to cities across the globe. Today's talk is titled Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. And with that, allow me to introduce Gordon Chang. Gordon, please.
Well, thank you so much, Len. Communist China has a plan to destroy America, and the hostility is evident for all to see. In May 2019, People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, carried a landmark editorial that declared a people's war on us. Now, we're Americans, and so most of us say, well, that's just propaganda, and we dismiss it. But that's a mistake. It's a mistake because the Communist Party of China, with its strident anti-Americanism, is creating a justification to strike America. The party believes that it is in an existential struggle with us. And it believes that not because of anything that we say or do, but because of who we are. You have an insecure regime in Beijing is worried about the inspirational impact of our American values and form of governance on the Chinese people. And that means we will not have amicable relations with China for as long as it exists under communist rule. Question is it really that hostile? Well, we go back a quarter century ago when General Cher Haoteng, who was defense minister and vice chairman of the Communist Party's Central Military Commission, reportedly gave a speech that advocated the extermination of the American people. His plan was to use disease to clear out the hills, the valleys, the plains of North America so that the Chinese people could settle in the vast spaces that were left uninhabited. Quote, "It is indeed brutal to kill 1 to 200 million Americans," he said. Quote, "But this is the only path that will secure a Chinese century, a century where the Communist Party leads the world." When this speech was revealed in 2005, it was fantastical that the Communist Party would use germs, microbes, and viruses to commit such a genocide. Now, this speech has not been verified, so the question is, did he actually give it? And from the events that have occurred since then, it appears that he in fact did. So for instance, we can take a clue from the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 originated in all probability from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We got to remember that no later than the second week of December of 2019, Chinese leaders knew that SARS-CoV-2, the pathogen that causes this disease, was highly transmissible human to human. But not until January 20 of the following year did they admit for the first time that it was indeed contagious. But of course, they knew it was highly contagious. And at the same time that they were locking down their own country, yes, lockdowns are controversial, but by locking down China, they were telling the world they thought this was an effective way of stopping disease. So while Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, was locking down his own country, he was pressuring other countries to accept arrivals from China without travel restrictions or quarantines. Now, by downplaying and denying contagiousness, he lulled health officials around the world into not taking precautions that they otherwise would have. And they did that not only by directly contacting health officials around the world, but also propagating that false narrative through the World Health Organization. Now, you put these two things together, lying about contagiousness and taking these passengers and having them accepted around the world because they're the ones who spread this disease. By doing those two things, it shows that the spread of COVID-19 was deliberate. And that's why we are visiting these old events, because they show that the Communist Party indeed has the maliciousness that General Che Haotun reportedly revealed at the turn of the century. And they also show that the Communist Party is capable of unfathomable evil, because we have to remember that according to Johns Hopkins coronavirus tracker, 7 million people outside China died from this disease. That includes 1.2 million Americans. These are people who should not have gotten the disease that should have been if the Communist Party was working to the betterment of humanity. This was a disease that should not have left the central part of China. So the question is, going forward, what are we going to do? Well, we got to remember that the Communist Party, even today, in a tightly controlled public square, permits discussion of the extermination of the American people. So, for instance, in late 2020, Li Yi, who is a sociologist, gave a public lecture in which he said this, quote, "We are ahead of schedule in terms of overtaking the United States." Quote, "There will be no problem reaching this goal in 2027, as he was referring to the devastation of America by COVID. Quote, "The US will not survive." And just to make it clear that he was not making a prediction, that he was advocating this course of action, he then said this, quote, "As long as we go to work every day, we will drive the US to its death." The next disease is coming from China, in all probability. We know this because Chinese researchers publicly talk about, quote, "specific ethnic genetic attacks." In other words, attacks caused by pathogens that will leave Chinese people immune, but will sicken or kill everybody else. So the next disease is coming our way. And indeed, it might already be here. An alert building inspector in Greeley, California, near Fresno in the Central Valley of California, in December 2022, discovered what was clearly a secret Chinese biological weapons facility. Inside, there were at least 20 pathogens, according to the official count, and almost 1,000 mice that had been genetically engineered to spread disease. Now, one of those pathogens was the one for Ebola. Ebola in its natural state has a 50% fatality rate. The good thing about Ebola, however, is that it is not readily transmissible. But we know that at the Wuhan Institute of Virology at this moment, they are studying Ebola, which means they are weaponizing Ebola, which means if they can increase its lethality, but more important, if they can increase its transmissibility, they will have a weapon to exterminate the American population. This will be the weapon that General Zhou Tun was talking about at 2005. So where does that leave us? Well, that's not the only attack on America. There's also fentanyl. Fentanyl each year in doses from China kill an estimated 70 to 75,000 Americans. As a Brookings scholar said a couple years ago, this is the deadliest epidemic in American history, or deadliest drug epidemic in American history. Fentanyl was one of the most important topics that was discussed last November 15th when Xi Jinping was at Woodside, California, talking to President Biden. And on the following day, Biden talked to the American people and said that Xi Jinping had promised to significantly reduce the flow of fentanyl precursors and pill presses across the Pacific to the Western Hemisphere. But this was the same Xi Jinping who made essentially the same promise to President Trump in 2018 and to President Obama in 2016. And of course, Xi Jinping has been violating those prior pledges. And I think he did that because fentanyl is an integral part of his plan to weaken America. Primarily, it's two Mexican cartels, with the help of Chinese technicians, mix precursors from China. They make it into fentanyl, and then they smuggle it across the southern border. But make no mistake, this is an attack by the Communist Party of China. These fentanyl gangs are large, they're well organized, they're international in scope. They could not operate in China's near total surveillance state without the knowledge and the approval of the Communist Party. But we don't have to speculate. We know that some of the fentanyl producers are state-owned. And we also know that the Chinese central government gives subsidies for the production of fentanyl. In addition, Chinese diplomats provide diplomatic cover to the fentanyl gangs. We know that every container that leaves China is inspected by Chinese officials, and these fentanyl gangs, they launder their proceeds through the Chinese state banking system. China's own TikTok, which Beijing uses to propagate its narratives, promotes illicit drug use in the United States. And that means the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans a year is indeed deliberate. But there's another Chinese attack across our southern border. 2 years ago, Chinese migrants coming in from Mexico were primarily family groups. In other words, they were people who were desperate to live in a free society. But now the composition of Chinese migrants have changed. At least 2/3, and at some border crossings, 85% of Chinese migrants are single males of military age, traveling without family members, some of them pretending not to speak English. They're coming across in packs of 5 to 15, and US Border Patrol knows that some of them have links to the Chinese military. Now the Chinese are also coming across our northern border. In February, Border Patrol apprehended 3 Chinese migrants coming in from Canada into Maine. What was ominous about this incident was that there was a 4th Chinese national on our side of the border who was obviously there by prearrangement to help them smuggle themselves into the US. Now, if you want to live in a free society and you're a Chinese or any other migrant, you're going to want to surrender to Border Patrol because that way you get yourself into the asylum system, as well as you get a debit card from New York City and all the other benefits. If, however, you're trying to come into the United States undetected, it means you're trying to come in for some nefarious purpose. Well, who are these migrants? In January of this year, DefiantAmerica.org posted pictures of Chinese migrants who had come in from Mexico less than 3 weeks, who were taking, and they came in with no money and no documentation. And what were they doing? They were taking target practice with pistols, and in one case, a sniper rifle. Now, if you wanted to live in a free society, you'd probably be thinking about where your next meal is, where you're going to get a job, where you're going to live. You probably wouldn't be thinking of sharpening your skills of using an automatic weapon. Now, the Defiant America images were taken from some desert location. But Blaine Holt, a retired U.S. Air Force general who lives in Green, Idaho, says the same thing is taking place in his state. And we are also getting reports of Chinese migrants taking target practice in places such as Delaware. We've got to be extremely concerned because one can think of these migrants being directed by Beijing to pick up mice from facilities like Reedley and spreading them around the US. But we also know that as there's been an increase in Chinese migrants coming across our border, there's also been an increase of Chinese nationals trying to intrude onto American military facilities. So for instance, in September, a Chinese national tried twice to sneak onto a US nuclear weapons facility. These incursions are occurring all the time. So we've got to wonder what's going on here. They are, of course, planning, they're looking at our vulnerabilities, they're trying to look at our patterns, they are planning to attack the United States. And this could very well be the first time since the War of 1812 that we Americans will have to fight an enemy in sustained battles on our own soil. Now, these disturbing developments come while Xi Jinping is talking about war. And he's not only talking about it, he is actually waging proxy contests on 3 continents: in Europe, in Ukraine, in Africa, across its northern areas, both above and below the Sahara, and in Asia, in the western part, in Israel and Iran. Now, what is Xi Jinping doing? I think that he is taking 2 pages out of his heroes, Mao Zedong's Peasant Movement Playbook. And this is for Julia. I think that the first page involves encircling the cities from the countryside. That's what Mao Zedong did in 1949 when he prevailed in the Chinese Civil War over Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. And I believe that Xi Jinping views Ukraine, Africa, Israel as countryside, and we are the city. The second page of Mao's playbook involves chaos. Quote, "Great chaos under heaven achieves great order under heaven." Those words came from a 1966 letter of Mao Zedong to his wife at the time, Chang. And by great order under heaven, Mao Zedong was referring to worldwide Chinese rule. So I suspect that Xi Jinping looks at the disruption of societies around the world, which he's causing, as really intermediary steps to his complete control of humanity. These are proxy wars, but China is actually thinking of starting a war itself. And we know this from Xi Jinping's language because his now favorite phrase is dare to fight. And that message has been filtering down to the Chinese military, which repeatedly tells us it is ready to fight. But it's more than just words. So for instance, Xi Jinping is implementing the fastest and the biggest military buildup since the Second World War. He's trying to sanction-proof his regime. He's stockpiling grain and other commodities. He is firing military officers who are opposed to going to war. He's surveying the US for nuclear weapon strikes. That, by the way, was that rather large object that floated over our country in January and February of last year, which surveyed all of our Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile sites. That's 3 Air Force bases, Maelstrom, F.E. Warren, and Minot. It also passed close by to Omaha, Nebraska, which means it was picking up signals from Offutt Air Force Base, where U.S. Strategic Command is based. That's the home that controls all of America's nukes. And it also conveniently flew over Whiteman Air Force Base in the middle of Missouri, where we have all of our B-2s. And in addition to all of this, Xi Jinping is mobilizing China's civilians for war. 2 years ago, a Chinese entrepreneur making medical equipment for the civilian sector told me that Communist Party officials had visited him in his office and demanded that he convert all of his production lines in China to make items for the Chinese military. Communist officials have been going around to other entrepreneurs throughout the country making similar demands. And this entrepreneur also told me that the party was now operating factories which were once privately owned because their owners, having received similar demands, had decided to flee. They did not want to stick around for Xi Jinping's war. Civilian mobilization continues. In the beginning of this year, we learned from the Financial Times that state enterprises were standing up militia units in their own organizations. And about 6 weeks ago, China started calling up reservists, which is another war signal. Now, fortunately, this week, we have seen China's military and Coast Guard and Marine militia go quiet. And I think that this was probably a reaction to the US presidential election. But before that, China's forces were flying into Japanese territorial airspace and slicing through Japanese territorial water. They had been intruding deep into Indian-controlled territory in the Himalayas. They were encircling Taiwan in these particularly provocative exercises. And perhaps most dangerously, they were engaging in belligerent activities in the South China Sea against the Philippines. Taiwan is of particular concern. Xi Jinping has repeatedly and publicly said that he will be the one to annex Taiwan. Therefore, he has been staking his personal legitimacy on taking over the island republic. Recently, Taiwan officials have been telling visiting foreigners that they expect that within months, China will impose a quarantine on Taiwan. Now, a quarantine is not an act of war, but in today's circumstances, I think that it would lead to at least a blockade, which is an act of war, and perhaps even to something worse. We know right now that Xi Jinping has created a political system in Beijing where only hostile answers are considered to be acceptable. And that means we cannot be sure that if he starts something, that he can control the escalation. Now, we don't know if Xi Jinping has actually made the decision to go to war. I don't think he has. But there's something we know 100%. 100% we know he's made the decision to risk war because he has been risking war even with American allies. And that means that even today, he has made the decision that he is willing to kill Americans. I think that he has incentives to do that. In 2012, when he became General Secretary of the Communist Party, in other words, China's ruler, he inherited a consensual political system, a system where no senior leader got too much credit or too much blame because every decision of consequence was shared across the political spectrum in Beijing, and certainly across the apex of political power, which is the Politburo Standing Committee. But since then, by taking power from almost everybody else, he now has accumulated accountability, which means he's got nobody else to blame. And to make matters worse, in 2012, Xi Jinping had a political system where there was very little cost to losing a political struggle. But Xi Jinping has substantially increased the costs of losing struggles because he's been jailing opponents, he's been stripping them of their assets, and he's been even going after their families, which means that Xi Jinping has a very low threshold of risk at this moment. And indeed, there are signs of infighting. There are signs of infighting because Xi Jinping is being blamed for the situation inside China. If you're Xi Jinping in 2017, you're loving it because you're getting all the credit for all the good things that are happening to China. But if you're Xi Jinping in 2024, life is not so pleasant because you're being blamed for everything. And there's a lot to be blamed for. There are simultaneous crises of a crumbling economy, plunging property prices, continuing debt defaults, falling currency, accelerating capital flight, worsening food shortages, failing local governments, deteriorating environment, and even eroding demography. And Xi Jinping has no answers for these. In fact, his policies, for which he's being blamed, are actually aggravating these situations. So I think that Xi Jinping must be seeing a closing window of opportunity, which means in his mind, he probably believes he needs to act fast. And he needs to act fast not to rally the Chinese people. The Chinese people, the last thing they want is war. And I'm sure Xi Jinping knows that. But Xi Jinping needs to create disturbances abroad because he absolutely has to prevent other senior Communist Party figures from challenging or even deposing him. One final matter. It seems that we have just passed an historic inflection point, transitioning from a period of general calm to one of constant turbulence. And in this new era, we can see wars spreading. As mentioned, Europe, Africa, Asia. Now, a lot of people will tell you, oh, these are just regional conflicts. They're unrelated. No, that's not right. Today, there is no such thing as a regional conflict. There's no such thing as a regional conflict because China and Russia, either directly or indirectly, are fighting around the world, which means that every disturbance has a global implication. Go back to the late 1930s. There were separate wars around the world. They merged into what we now call World War II. And so the question for us is, are these conflicts going to merge today? Well, Xi Jinping at this moment has every reason to merge these conflicts. He has every reason to make his crisis our crisis. He has every reason to plunge the world into war. And we can only hope that with the change in administrations in Washington, that will change his calculus. Thanks very much.